Hey, welcome to another picture-in-picture commentary of the history of comics on film. This is still part of what I consider the second season. The second season, whereas I guess the first season was mostly made up of movies from the 40s and a few things from the 50s, some television series and movies from the 50s. This season focuses on TV series and films from the 1960s. And so this is kind of exciting, I guess, for some people, because a lot of people are kind of like, when are you going to get to Marvel stuff? When are you going to do Marvel stuff? So a lot of people, looking forward to Marvel stuff. I like comics, superheroes, as much as everybody else. I guess if you put a gun to my head, I'm more a DC guy than a Marvel guy, but I love Marvel. And so here you've got the what I like to refer to as the first motion comics ever made, with the Grant Trey Lawrence, 5-day-a-week Marvel superheroes. What's cool about them is, just like these panels show you, it's straight out of the comic books, pretty much. I mean, there's a couple episodes where I was like, this doesn't really fit any comic story I know of, but the majority of them, panel for panel like that. And so learning how to make those comparison shots, the side-by-side shots, which I first learned how to do in Movie Maker, which was a little more complicated than it is in Premiere. So it took a while, but eventually I figured out how to do it. Now, I keep talking about what I've been using. Now, I think by this point, I think this is long enough that it was one of the first ones I posted to Blip TV, because I think initially I was planning on doing what I did with the Filmation DC superheroes. I was planning on doing a Captain America segment, doing a Thor segment, doing an Iron Man segment, doing a Namor segment, and doing a Hulk segment. But when I started writing, my process is I have a big list of the films that I'm going to do. When it comes to the decade, I basically number them in order, and kind of, narrow down, when they aired and in what sequence I'm going to do it, because I want it to be done chronologically. And then once I have all that order set up, I go through and I sort of write my basic outline of what I want to talk about, and then, I tend to, usually, most of the stuff I've seen, I guess some of the stuff like the Archie stuff, I'm seeing for the first time, but a lot of the superhero stuff I've seen before, but I like to rewatch it and kind of take notes and, pay attention as I'm going in case there's something I missed, or maybe it'll jog my memory and go, hey, I want to include the first appearance of the Red Skull, or that kind of thing. So once I have all that written, then I, record the audio, and then I, capture all my footage from my DVDs and stuff like that, and then I edit it. But with this, when I was in the writing stages, I kind of realized that my editorial, my opinion on Captain America is going to be the same as it is on the Hulk and Thor and Iron Man and Namor, because, it's all the same animation style. So I just kind of decided, you know what, instead of making them all little individual segments, of about, 5 or 7 minutes apiece, which probably would have worked better on YouTube, I think at this point I had decided and resigned myself to, hey, I'm going to start using Blip TV from now on, because I can make the videos as long as I want, and not have to be locked into that whole 10-minute thing. And I know on YouTube, I suppose you could do part 1 and part 2 and part 3, but I always thought that was kind of annoying, so I'm kind of glad I can just post the whole 20-minute video on in one post. So anyhow, that's kind of my rationale and reasons for why I have it set up the way I did. And then this is something where I wanted to have some fun with special effects. I started branching out and trying to mess around with Photoshop here. And this is a joke, if you don't know about it. I'm sure anybody who reads comics knows about Hank Pym going nuts and smacking around his wife and having a mental breakdown and attacking the Avengers. So that's kind of a little joke on that. So with this, it's kind of interesting too, because I guess, unless you count the United They Stand cartoon, there's not really a whole lot of Avengers cartoons at all. But in a lot of these little shorts on Captain America and even Thor and Iron Man and stuff, they have a lot of the Avengers characters, even in the episodes of the Hulk, just because the stories, come from the comic books and they sort of tie straight into the comic books. So it was kind of interesting watching, kind of going, oh hey, it's going to start with some of the Cap stories from Tales of Suspense, that Kirby did, and then it kind of, Captain America segues into like a lot of these Avengers stories, where they're fighting against the Masters of Evil and stuff. Which, by the way, the new Avengers Earth Mightiest Heroes micro episodes have been coming on, and those are pretty cool, I think. But I was kind of sad because I just saw the one where Bucky and they do the whole backstory, but I guess they swapped Zemo out for the Skull. So anyway, and speaking of comic lexicons and things like that, like I have in the past, Earth X is and Galactic Storm are two pretty big stories that are ingrained in my head in interpretations of Captain America. And so I wanted to bring up the whole Mr. Cap, like, you're not getting away with that, Mr. And then, of course, part of my lexicon, of course, is going to be toys that I grew up with. And so that's why I wanted to mention, hey, I didn't know who the hell Baron Zemo was until there was an action figure of him. And I think that's kind of cool and kind of weird, because sometimes you can go like years and years and years and not remember people's names and stories because they're, I don't want to say forgettable, but sometimes it's like, a sci-fi movie of the week, unless you're taking diligent notes on it, you're not going to remember that the girl who was the lead in Piranha Eating Outer Space Flying Monkeys #2 was named June. Do you know what I mean? Like, you're just not going to remember that. But if they had like a bunch of action figures, like, maybe you would, because it's like, I always notice, that's kind of funny. I was just noticing that somebody posted about how on Mattel's site they've got the new wave of Green Lantern figures, and I started thinking, hey, now everybody's going to know who all these Green Lantern guys are now, because they all have action figures. So, anyhow, the point with that was, the first time I was ever sort of exposed to Baron Zemo was in the Secret War series. The same thing's true of Falcon right there, doing the drop kick. So yeah, a lot of those guys, I kind of went, hey, I don't know who these guys are, but, it was kind of cool, Secret Wars. They had the little comics on the back that sort of gave you a brief explanation of who they were. Now, I'm not sure. Maybe I should have gone into a little more detail about Power Man and how he's Goliath from the Thunderbolts and all that kind of stuff, but I don't know. I figured this was pretty comprehensive as it was, dealing with 5 different characters, and I just kind of decided to, mention that Cap fought the Super Adaptoid and all these other guys, but I didn't feel the need to kind of say, oh, this is his first appearance, this is his first appearance, this is his first appearance. I thought it might be a bit too much. But I guess I kind of reneged on that, like with the Spider-Man piece I did later, because I was like, hey, I'm going to do everybody on that. And maybe, who knows, maybe I'll mention it again or reference it later, because sometimes there were certain things I didn't have access to at the time. I mean, part of me fantasizes about doing a special edition of this particular segment, just because some of the Region 2 DVDs from the UK have a lot better film quality than some of these VHS tapes that I got most of this from. So part of me kind of wishes, like, oh, maybe, if I was lame and George Lucasy, I would go back and sort of re-edit Some of this with better footage, maybe. But I don't know. I'd rather exert my energy into making newer videos and continuing to learn from whatever whatever mistakes or things you kind of learn as you go along and kind of go, oh hey, like the movie maker stuff where I would always see the little clips and freeze frames that I didn't notice before, and so in Adobe it's really easy to correct that. I usually just go in and usually make a freeze frame of about a millisecond of that stuff, and so that doesn't come up as often. And so yeah, I wanted to mention how the Hulk was originally gray, but what's kind of interesting about the actual episode is here's the exact panel except for they colored him green. So and I just want to mention, I mean, I've done some top 10 comic book lists, and some people do or don't like Peter David as a writer or as a person, or I don't know, what have you. I know he got into his whole big thing with Eric Larson and different things like that, but for the most part, I really enjoy Peter David's work as a writer. I don't know that I think he's the, I don't know the man personally, but, it's not like he's always the nicest guy in the world, but I don't really care about that so much as the work itself, and he seems to be very interested in the characters and the continuity and making things interesting and continuing to hold people's interests over long runs. And the Hulk's a good example of that. I mean, he worked on the comic for, 10 years, 14 years? God, I don't even know, but a long time, long run. And it went from him being green to gray to back to green again to being Professor Hulk to being crazy, savage, crazy Banner to being, Maestro-looking Hulk and all kinds of stuff. Until it finally ended, and then of course here, I put a disclaimer when I posted this on Earth's Mightiest and comic book movies, but of course my speculation was that Rolk here was going to be what's his face, Talbot, but it actually turned out to be General frickin' Ross, which I hate. Not because it doesn't make sense, but because, Rolk, killed General Ross, and there's all these, red herring, things, it's like, oh, but it was, LMD, and I'm like, come on, it's more Jeff Loeb hack stuff, where he's, making these murder mysteries that don't make any goddamn sense. But anyway, whatever, it's not a big deal. But, anyway, I thought it was kind of silly. I thought it was going to be Talbot for sure, but it wasn't. And what's cool about this is Talbot is like Tony Stark, is like Namor, is like Rupert Thorne, is like, so anyway, I think that's kind of neat. But yeah, I'm totally used to that guy's voice. I mean, you may know it pretty well from Rupert Thorne maybe or something like that. But, to me, I'm kind of like, oh, hey, he was General Ross, he was Rupert Thorne, he was Iron Man, so he was all kinds of people. So I thought it was pretty cool. Hey, and there's Gabe Lang. So, and then here we got some reference to the Gargoyle, who was kind of like a one-shot villain in the comics, but here in the Hulk TV series, he kind of became like the, I don't know, like the, not, I don't want to say the Krang, because Krang was kind of in charge of Shredder, but kind of like that the MODOK of the Hulk series, kind of like the secondary sidekick toady villain to the main villain, It's like if, Mandarin is to the leader as MODOK is to the Gargoyle. And so here you got the leader being the brains of the Hulk's brawn. And I figured, this is another through line that I wanted to follow. Obviously he's on the Hulk TV cartoon here, and then also the little nod to the leader in the last Hulk movie. Yeah, and so then we're moving on to Iron Man here, which is what the theme for the second season is. It's actually from this Iron Man show, only in the theatrical movie, it's a band, playing at like an awards ceremony for Tony Stark, which is kind of a cool little Easter egg for people that are familiar with the old cartoon. And here's the racetrack thing, which by now people are probably familiar with from Iron Man 2. But yeah, so we got Pepper Potts and Happy Hogan, which is kind of interesting because eventually it got to the point in the comics where, Pepper, I know they're playing up, again, the whole Pepper Tony Stark thing, but eventually they had Pepper, give up on Tony Stark and go after Happy Hogan. And then her and Happy were married, and then they ended up having to kill Happy off because I guess they wanted to use her as a love interest again or whatever. So maybe I got some of that wrong, but who knows? I'm sure somebody will correct me if I did. My little brief Iron Man Happy Hogan Pepper Potts summary. And then here we got the Mandarin. Who's like another Trade Federation goofball, here anyway, which I guess I can understand why they never decide to play up the Mandarin's heritage, even though he's named the Mandarin. Like, I don't know. Sometimes I always wonder, I'm like, okay, so you changed his skin green, but he's still named the Mandarin. Like, but, anyway. I kind of like Temujin, and I know some people hate the Teen Tony cartoon, but I think it's okay. But it's kind of cool that they used him, Temujin, the Mandarin's son, in that piece instead of the actual, Mandarin. Speaking of which, I could have sworn they said they were going to do a second season of that, but I haven't seen anything. But I guess they swore they were going to do a second season of Wolverine and the X-Men and Fantastic Four, too, but they didn't do that either. But anyway, my point is, I really like Temujin from the Mike Grell run on Iron Man. I don't know if that was the second or first or third time that Iron Man revealed his secret identity to the world, but I remember in that run, it was one of the first times he went, to hell with it, I'm Iron Man, whatever, which I thought was kind of cool, but I think it was in vogue at that point. It's like Steve Rogers was taking off his mask, and all these guys in Marvel were taking off their mask going, I am, whoever it is. And so this was something interesting too, was I wanted to mention the Chameleon and Kraven the Hunter because they made appearances, but I also kind of wanted to save them for later, for mentioning in Spider-Man, a first appearance, which is kind of interesting because then I did later in Namor bring up Doom's first appearance, which I didn't save for later for the Fantastic Four cartoon. So I don't know. I guess it's how I get to it. I felt weird talking about Doom without bringing up his first appearance in the Namor piece, but I didn't feel so weird talking about, I guess, Kraven and Chameleon because maybe they're not as well known as Doctor Doom. I don't know. I don't know what my rationalization for that is, other than it's just kind of what I did. I figure, I'll get to the Chameleon later on in, in the other Spider-Man cartoons, and the same thing with Kraven. They're not going anywhere. And I guess Doom wasn't going anywhere either, but I figured historically it's a big deal. It's since Namor, here is technically the first place Doom showed up, at least in my chronological order of worlds. And so, hey, okay, so now we're already into Thor. This is a pretty cool replication of a Kirby panel from Journey into Mystery, I think. And here we got Jane Foster, who I guess in the new movie is going to be a doctor. And doesn't look like there's going to be any Don Blake, which I'm kind of sad about. But yeah, and so what's funny here too is they always mention this, is like Odin, like in one scene will have like one helmet that Jack Kirby drew. And then, like, he'll have another helmet that, like, I forget, I think, like, Don Heck or something. Like, you know, it's like, how many helmets? It's not just me, like, taking clips from, like, different scenes. It's like, this is literally, some of these scenes are literally, you know, yeah, like, one after the other, where, you know, all of a sudden his costume changed. It's like Rob Liefeld did the animation on this or something. But anyway... And this is something else, too, that I always kind of, you know, had to question, is how many times can, you know, Starscream or Loki or whoever betray you before you lock his ass up and throw away the key, or just kill the guy outright for treachery. You know, there's death by treason, you know, like, there's no death by treason on Asgard, I guess, because, like, the Joker or whoever else, it's like, oh, Loki's the main arch nemesis, and we need to keep him alive, because he makes for conflict, and he's interesting, and I guess I get all that, but, you know, sometimes you're just kind of like, come on, dude. And so, of course, I've always totally been hung up on the Enchantress, probably since Secret Wars. I think Mike Zeck draws a really, really attractive-looking Enchantress. And so this was a chance to go into her character and talk about her background a bit more. You know, how she's hung up on Thor. And for the most part, except for that one Mike Deodato run, I never got the idea that Thor was that hung up on her. You know, it was always Jane Foster or Sif or somebody like that. So I thought it was kind of cool when they finally did that Mike Deodato run, and she hooked up with Thor, and she wasn't such a, you know, evil so-and-so. During that period, kind of like a whole Black Cat Spider-Man vibe, I guess. And so here's another guy, rival of Thor, the Absorbing Man, which I got to go through his sort of television and cinematic history in a brief, you know, couple seconds, if you will. And so we've got the Calvin Zabo hide, and the Grey Gargoyle. So yeah, like there were plenty of characters here that I figured wouldn't get much play later on, and I figured I might as well talk about them now. That's kind of, I guess it's kind of my rationalization for how I talk about certain characters. You know, I think, like, with something like, say, Spider-Man, I figure, you know, I don't have to go into his cinematic and film history because I'm actually going to cover those stories later on. But, you know, here at the time, this is before the Thor movie. Well, I guess it had been announced. But, you know, it's like, it's kind of pre-Thor movie, pre-Avengers Earth's Mightiest Heroes, pre-anything else. So I figured, you know what? This is probably the one chance I'm going to get to talk about Thor. So I better cover those details, you know, as best I can. Same thing with Namor, you know, really. Yeah, and John Rhys-Davies does an awesome Thor. I really like his voice work in Fantastic Four. Odin's Donuts. Yeah, and so this is my way of kind of knocking some of the goofy stuff I think about Thor in different film and TV projects. Even though, you know, don't get me wrong, I love the goofy TV Thor here, but he is kind of funny. And this is me sort of coming clean about, you know, kind of, you know, how I've always sort of felt about Thor. Which was, you know, since he's a rival for Superman, I kind of give him crap all the time. You know, and I'm trying to be fair and say these are the things about Thor that I enjoyed or liked or whatever. You you know, and I think now, since I see Thor as kind of the Superman of the Avengers, it's like on this Earth's Mightiest cartoon, I don't want to see him get knocked around and beat up too much. But yeah, so, and then here we've got some stuff on Namor. And the Bill Everett early stories in Marvel Comics. So yeah, I mean, it's guys like Namor and Captain America and the original Human Torch. You know, they're kind of the golden age, the whole timely comics thing pre-Marvel. Yeah, and so yeah, looking at this now, you know, I do kind of wish I had better footage of Namor. But there's not too much I can do about that. And then I felt like including this because, you know, this is something I always remember as kind of going, why is he shooting electricity? But I guess he's mimicking the electric eel. So, yeah. Okay, so this is, sorry about the cutoff there. So now we're getting into some of Namor's villains, who I figured I'd probably never get a chance to explore later on, like Atuma or Krang, and of course that's not to be confused with Krang. So, anyway, but yeah, not to be confused with Krang. It's the Warlord Krang. And Namor in his goofy little thong there. You know, it's funny, when I was younger, the three Marvel guys, and it's not Thor, the three Marvel guys who I thought were the absolute goofiest were the Punisher, Namor, and Doctor Strange. And what's funny is I've kind of come to appreciate all three of those characters. I really, really loved the Steve Ditko Doctor Strange, and even some of the Jackson Geist stuff later on. Namor, I probably got way more into Namor when John Byrne did his, Namor book, which I thought was pretty cool. Which I sort of followed more out of the fact that it was John Byrne than Namor, because, like I said, I didn't have much of a interest in Namor. And then Punisher, who I thought was kind of a goofball too, until I think Circle of Blood was pretty cool. And when I finally read that, I enjoyed that. And later on, I think these days I appreciate Punisher a little more. There's some good runs in there, and a lot of good artists did get their start on Punisher too. A lot of the Image guys like Larson and Jim Lee and Willis Portacio and stuff like that. So there's lots of good art in some early Punisher stuff. So anyway, just a little dovetail into that. And then here we've got the Hanna-Barbera Fantastic Four cartoon, which has Atuma in it, but ironically does not have Namor. And what's interesting is the Fantastic Four Hanna-Barbera cartoon also literally adapted straight from the Fantastic Four comics, but when it came to the Fantastic Four issues, like I think number 4 and I think it's number 11, where you've got those stories. In one of them, Namor is changed into like a doctor who turns into like a evil fish man who looks kind of like Despero. And then in that one, that clip you just saw with the blue-looking kind of Namor, they changed his name to Prince Triton. And so I guess because of the Grand Trey Lawrence series that was going on, Hanna-Barbera did not have the rights to use Namor. And again, something I was mentioning about the Avengers showing up before. And I guess this is part of my editorial about how I think, as opposed to the Batman TV series where it was kind of like a kitsch thing, seeing thought balloons and pow wham bams, or like here with the actual thought balloon, I don't know, that just kind of makes me cringe. It's the kind of stuff I've always not liked about motion comics. I think that Watchmen motion comic I kind of don't like as much as I could have because they were cheap. They only hired one actor. And it's not the actor's fault. I mean, he does a good job, you know, don't get me wrong, but they just hired one guy. Anyway, I guess my point with that is, and this is going to be a long credit sequence so I can talk a little bit about it, is that the more voice actors you have, the better it comes across, and then the more motion and less dialogue balloons, the better those kind of motion comic-ish things come across. The recent Jonah Hex motion comic and even the Iron Man Extremis motion comic I thought were really, really cool, actually, and kind of broke away from my stigma of motion comics. Because normally I kind of watch them and kind of go, you know. But anyway, this is, thanks again for watching, and please continue to watch.